a room. And today we are going to have a presentation around intellectual originality and higher education in Africa. So we have got our presenter and our discussant. Our presenter is online and our discussant is us here. So today we'll do things a bit different. So we have presenter. We take 20 minutes of the time, and then after we discuss it, we come in for 10 minutes, and then we give much time for everyone to engage in the presentation, hoping that people will enjoy the presentation. So maybe before the presenter comes on, let me share his brief bio that he presented to us here. So, Professor Aghogho Akpome is an associate professor in the Department of English, University of Zululand in South Africa. He was a research associate at the Center for African Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa, and has been a visiting scholar at the Center for Post-Colonial and Gender Studies at the University of Naples in L'Oriental, as well as the Institute of English Language and Literature in Freie University in Berlin. His research interests include African thought, decolonization, African literatures, discourse, and migration. His recent presentation includes Towards a Digitalization Charter, an African thought perspective on digitalization, sovereignty, and multipolarity. He is currently engaged in a project titled Africa in BRICS in the age of multipolarity. In the age of multipolarity and African thought inquiry. His most recent publication, which is co-authored, is titled Languages Are Not Developed, They Developed. So rethinking language development in Africa, and also he is an NRF-rated researcher. So maybe also to say the brief bio for our discussant, who is Dr. Fadzai M. Maruza, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of the Free State under the Center for Research on Higher Education and Human Development. Here, research focus on higher education policy, with particular emphasis on inclusion and comparative policy analysis in African context. She critically examines how universities conceptualize inclusion in policy. Her recent work includes comparative policy studies on stability frameworks in African universities and post-doctoral policy representation in South African higher education. So, as I indicated earlier to say, I will give you, Prof, 20 minutes of the presentation, and when we are 10 minutes down the line, I will indicate that you are left with 10 minutes and 5 minutes also, as you suggested. And then after that, we'll then give the floor to the discussant to engage with your presentation. And thereafter, we'll open up for the room and those online to engage on your presentation. So, Prof, your time starts now. You can share your presentation.
Okay, good morning, colleagues. Good morning from Kwadlagenzwa. If you did not know that, then you had a bad geography teacher in high school. If you don't know where Kwadlagenzwa is, it's the center of the world. I thank the organizers, in particular, Dr. Paul Michael, for reaching out to me. I'm humbled. I hope that the rantings that I will engage in the next 15 to 20 minutes would be useful to you. And now is when I share. Second. Yes, I have so many windows open because I kept updating the presentation. Is it showing now as it should?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. So Here's my abstract, which mutated a bit, Dr. Michael, after I sent it, and my dear respondent. In this presentation, I make a case for enhanced originality in the principle and practice of higher education across Africa. The discussion is divided into two broad parts. In the first, which is the longer part, I follow Paulin Hutunji to demonstrate the ways in which intellectual activity within universities in Africa remains predominantly extroverted. I argue that this phenomenon continues to defy decades of anti- and decolonial resistance and is being reinforced through the forces of contemporary globalization, the most recent of which is linked to increased digitalization and the rise of AI. To redress this problematical condition of near perpetual pupillage, I propose in the second part of the discussion a path towards dismantling what Clanclamarke calls the architecture of imitation in African higher education. My proposal is encoded within the emergent formulation of African thought, a theoretical and programmatic approach based on an intellectual reorientation that is authentic, original, and propositional. So here's the structure. I'll begin with a short preamble where I offer notes on my approach and methods, and then I'll speak about intellectual extroversion in a historical perspective. I'll speak about it in contemporary times, and then I now turn to the proposal of how we may be able to enhance intellectual originality in Africa. I'll give notes on African thought and say a few things about theory and research. I'm unlikely to say much about teaching and learning for the time that we have. So my approach is predominantly non-disciplinary. It's not transdisciplinary, it's not multidisciplinary, it's not cross-disciplinary. It is non-disciplinary. It's an approach that rejects the insistence on a disciplinary architecture of knowledge production and what knowledge is and knowledge conventions. That does not mean that I disregard knowledges or ideas produced within disciplines, or knowledges or ideas that have have emerged maybe within or through the architecture of disciplines. It is just that I do not commit myself to any individual discipline. I give myself the freedom to give the disciplines the middle finger when I think they don't serve my purpose. So that's mainly what I mean by non-disciplinary. This approach is consistent with, and perhaps to an extent influenced by, Louis Gordon, the American philosopher's impressive work, the Disciplinary Decadence, which he wrote in 2006, and where he argues for living thought. And I highlight those two words, decadence, because he shows the ways in which the received disciplines from their Euro-modernist origins and the times of the so-called European Enlightenment, their assumptions, the foundations on which they are built, which they still rely on, how they have mutated into decadent bodies of practice, decaying, dead, and not living, ossified is the word he uses. And he argues for living thought. I would qualify that by saying non-disciplinary approach allows us to have live and living thought, thought that is living, thought that we do not need to go and dig, we don't need archaeological means to bring them from some ancient scholar. And he asks for the teleological suspension of disciplinarity. I'll take it a little bit further and ask for the total rejection of disciplinarity. That would be my suggestion if I have the time, but not in this presentation. Also, the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois was born in France, I think, emigrated to the US, did a lot of work. He also showed in his work, especially in socialism, I beg your pardon, in sociology, how the disciplines contributed to the entrenchment of very deadly anti-Black racist practices in America in general. So the non-disciplinary turn for me follows on this in a way. My approach is largely discursive. I I argue that we recognize the importance of discourse as ideational. We recognize the importance, the centrality of discourse to knowledge creation and idea formation, and is consistent with some of the work that have been done by Foucault, Michel Foucault, which many of us know, and Parker, which many of us may not know. And I also strive to bring in inventionist, by which I mean actually formulation of ideas, which the Nigerian scholar Gabriel Akpata demonstrates very powerfully in some of his works, and which Ive Mudimbe, which we should know, of the Invention of Africa fame, demonstrated very powerfully in his two books, The Idea of Africa, The Invention of Africa, 1988 and 1994, books published in those years, and of course Oyeronke Oyewumi, the Nigerian gender scholar who talked about the invention of women. Of course, I am interested in experimentation. My approach to discourse might come across as polemics, but I think it's constructive polemics. Polemics is deconstructive in its approach to the canon, to the received canon, to the orthodoxy, and it is also largely decolonial as in orientation and in purpose. Okay, so here's the plan, a little preamble. I think I've shown this before, yeah. So let's talk quickly about extroversion in historical perspective. The background to extroversion is Euromodernism, is the conquest, which we all know, the history which we all know, but I don't want to go into detail about it. The point I want to highlight about this is what Tunde Bewaji and some other scholars call epistemicide, the destruction of non-European modes of knowledge, ways of knowing. A brilliant article was written in 1993 by Olufemi Taiwo, although he seems to have turned around in his recent work against decolonization. It's a very funny thing. But if you read his work on the colonization and its aftermath, he explains very powerfully, with specific regard to Nigeria and the Nigerian Academy, the Nigerian University, of the 1980s, 70s, and 80s. Interestingly, he talks about how colonialism succeeded in destroying indigenous, local, and autonomous modes of knowledge production, and the consequences of that. Of course, we all know the work of Walter Rodney in 1972, where he famously wrote about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And one of the things he mentions is also the epistemologies and the cognitive practices that resulted from acts of imperialism and colonization on much of the world. Rosa Luxemburg also has a contribution to that. She's the famous Polish-German reformer and radical activist. She also speaks about the ways in which capitalist colonialism contributed to the destruction of indigenous forms of knowledge production, also the indigenous forms of wealth production, forms of economic activity in the places that fell to the sword of European conquerors. Another background to extroversion is disciplinarity, which I spoke about a bit. And of course, the forceful universalization of Eurocentric orthodoxies, which the more recent decolonial scholars like Annibal Chiano, Walter Mignolo did define as the coloniality of knowledge. What I mean is this, is that in the forceful, in the violent expansion and imposition of specific provincial Eurocentric ideas and assumptions, in crafting these assumptions as orthodoxies, people under the jurisdiction of European coloniality are forced to internalize and approach as universal ideas which are actually provincial. So, and my argument here, this is reasons we need to, this is one of the ways we can understand why intellectual activity remains extroverted. That's a claim by Paulin Utunji, and I'll get to it shortly. Francis Nyamjo, which many of us would know, also wrote in 2012 about how surprisingly extremely resilient colonial education has been in Africa, in spite of all the colonial activity. Important to this also is the invention of the non-West. If you see, many of us know about the celebrated 18th century. The 18th century lived in the 1800s. 19th century, one of the canonical figures of European modernity, of Enlightenment epistemology, Hegel, who said nothing has come out of Africa. And of course, the Berlin Conference, in which whose communique expressed the need the European colonizers undertook. They declared that they were divinely mandated to improve, they used that word, the morals and the lives of the so-called native tribes, native peoples. Edward Said has a brilliant work called Orientalism, where he theorizes the discursive methods by which European knowledge production others, the non-European, creates an inferior, creates a binary inferior, binary opposite of the non-Western other as inferior, as of less value, as bad, as unattractive, as repulsive, as primitive, as backward, which also is what Mundimbe does in his two brilliant books I mentioned earlier. I have a work which follows on this tradition where I speak about the recent tracing of, actually beginning from the early 90s, the recent focus on corruption, on Africans as corrupt. I argue that it's a continuation of the centuries-old European instinct to characterize the non-Western as inferior. And that is done in particular contexts of neoliberal macroeconomics. We may not get to that, but let's proceed. So these are two very key texts for my work, for my argument. The first is from Paulin Hotunji, it's from the Republic of Benin, Western neighbors to Nigeria. And he makes this when he gave a presentation in 1995. And he says, quote, "Scientific and technological activity as practiced in Africa today is just as extroverted or externally oriented as economic activity. Most of the shortcomings that can be identified should not be perceived, therefore, as natural and inevitable. They should be traced back, on the contrary, to the history of the integration and subordination of our, that is, African traditional knowledge to world system of knowledge." And he calls it mental extroversion. So that's what I mean by extroversion. Depending on exogenous ideas coming from outside. But Ngugi wa Thiong'o clarifies things very well with this quote that I'm going to provide now. I think this, he's writing, of course, we know his famous book, Decolonization of the Mind, 1987. But here he's writing about what he calls linguistic erasure. And he's saying that the effects, quote, "the effects of linguistic erasure included looking at oneself from outside of the self or with the lenses of a stranger and identifying with the foreign base as the starting point towards the self. That is, from another self towards oneself, rather than using the local as the starting point from self to other selves." This is very important for me. And I think he is adumbrating Utunji's point very powerfully here, because he's tracing the practice of externally focused, externally oriented thinking, externally oriented intellectual orientation, externally oriented cognitive behavior to the way of seeing, to a situation where the individual moves outside themselves. It's like sitting in a room on I think the best way to think about this would be thinking of sitting on maybe the 10th floor of a tall building, a big room, and there are many windows. You cannot see the outside from that room. If you are standing at a window different from my window, you cannot see the outside in the same way that I see the outside. And the lament of these two luminaries here is that Africans have tended to look at the world, to see the world through the eyes of the other and the eyes of the West. I hope we'll say a few more things about this. So how has this manifested in contemporary times? Our curricula, which decolonialists have been shouting about like since forever, we still load our curricula with Weber and Kant and Rousseau and Shakespeare. In regard to Shakespeare, because I teach English, I'm employed to teach English. I really wonder what we do with Shakespeare. I asked in a recent publication, because Shakespeare doesn't speak the English we speak. I'm teaching kids in Kwatankezwa, kids from Ulundi, kids from Empangeni, kids from Giginlovu. I'm teaching them the English of Shakespeare to go and speak when they go to work. So why do I teach English? It's a question I can answer, but maybe not today. But we see it in the research, in our curriculum. We also see it in our theory and our research practices. We talk about the Harvard style, the Chicago style, the Vancouver style. I don't know when Dr. Michael is going to give us the Lagos style or the Benin style, or when, 10 minutes, thank you, sir. Or when Crespen will give us the Harare style, or when somebody will give us the Bloemfontein style. We privilege, this is interesting. Have you guys heard of this? There's a recent move to privilege publications made in the last 5 years in postgraduate study. I have no idea where this comes from, but we just do it. Some institutions just hear of something and then they begin to do it. Of course, we know about journal rankings, university rankings. Some institutions pay, in some South African institutions, pay higher shares of the subsidy if your publication is considered to be international. And international, dear colleagues, does not mean Eswatini, for your information, in case you don't get it correctly. It doesn't mean Lesotho. It doesn't mean Malawi. You know what international means to some of these people. And then you see some of the attitudes to decolonial scholarship. Some people absolutely disdain the idea of decolonial scholarship. You know, Jonathan Jansen, he published a book where he makes these extremely derogatory comments about the work done by decolonial scholars. My argument is that he's looking at decolonial scholarship from Western lenses. I do not see how anybody who approaches decolonial scholarship and decolonial orientation from an African perspective can dismiss or deride what decolonial scholars do. So a lot of this I'm saying is they link to some anecdotes and some personal experiences that may be different from yours. And our entire approach to the language of teaching and learning, like what I put in that brief CV I sent, the idea that a language has to be standardized. If there's time, we'll talk about it. It's a very interesting idea. The grammars that we use, by which I mean our formulations, our ideational formulations, our idioms. If we have time, we'll talk about A is for apple. But the frames of reference that we use in teaching. You know, we held a decolonial workshop with some colleagues at our university 2 or 3 years ago. I think maybe more than that. And my other colleague was advising the colleagues that when you give examples, use local examples. Then one of the colleagues said, what if there are no local examples? Then my colleague said, then why do you teach something if there is no local frame of reference to make it make sense to the people who you teach it to? Why would you teach such a thing? Well, that's one. So let's carry on. We now fetishize literature. We fetishize benchmarking, compliance, alignment. If you are in a South African university, you hear that every second of your life. How we went to benchmark, which is just a funky word for saying we went to find out what they're doing in Stellenbosch so that we can do the same. So we have universities who make policies, who do things, not because they see the reason to do it, but because WITS is doing it, because UCT is doing it. And if you go find out, WITS is doing it because Harvard is doing it. They have no internal endogenous understanding and justification of what they do. It's a big term in South Africa, benchmarking. Look it up. There's not so much time, so I'll skip Marke, who has really inspired a lot of what we are doing. So a very important manifestation of extroversion, that is intellectual extroversion, outside, thinking from the outside to the inside, seeing the world from outside rather than with your own eyes, looking at the outside from another person's window rather than from your own window, is some of the research problems. We're talking about research now. Some of the things we call research Like even climate change. I don't mind being a bit controversial here. And even immigration. Since when did immigration become an African problem? If you ask me, it seems since when did illegal immigration become a problem from an African society? A lot of this is lifted from the West, from elsewhere. Oh, we have problems. We have problems like poverty. We have problems like the land. We have problems like dispossession. But then we now make immigration is now our problem. Like, really? Kenya hosts the biggest migrant camp in the world. 20 decades of instability in Somalia has pushed people from Somalia, from Darfur, into Kenya and that region. When has Kenya gone to town to say that is their problem? Anyway, let's move on. So the theory, the model, research design, a lot of this we fashion according to somebody else's script. The methods from the North, but we just gather data, which is why Professor Sylvia Tamale, a Ugandan, said we have been turned many times, African researchers have been turned into glorified informants. I would also say we are sometimes glorified research assistants and stenographers in the work we do. Many of our collaborations and partnerships are with institutions in the North. They are not real partnerships, if we say the truth. We are told what to do. And in many cases, I've been informed of colleagues involved in this research where the outcome is almost already determined. And what you have to do is to add the African voice. It's like BEE compliance. You just have to comply so they know they're an African that was part of the work. And then digitalization and AI, again, an attempt to universalize exogenous assumptions, orthodoxies, and agendas, a lot of which are market-oriented, if you ask me about AI in education. So maybe we'll talk about that if we have a chance to answer questions so that you do not miss what I'm saying. The consequences is... so I don't know whether I'll need to say this because of time now. So I remember being once in a faculty research committee. We were debating a submission. And one colleague now said, oh, this proposal is very nice. The only thing is that this researcher doesn't mention the ecological theory. I therefore recommend that the students should go and rewrite this proposal and align it with ecological theory. And then I asked, so this entire PhD study, which is supposed to be contributing new knowledge, is you are now asking for the entire research to be reimagined in the image of a theory written by somebody who's probably dead and buried, and even his bones may have rotted. Then what is the purpose of the research? And this is what we do a lot. I attended a presentation post-COVID, I think this was 2022 or 2023, and this lady was presenting the effects of COVID on teaching and learning and the emergency remote teaching and the online teaching that we all started in 2022, 2021. And she was using ideas and theories from 1948, from people who never experienced that kind of thing in their lives. Because according to history, the last time the world experienced something close to COVID was the Spanish flu, the Black Flu of 1918. So how did that guy who died in 1970, how could he predict, how can his ideas be so relevant to the work you are doing in Gigindlovu in 2021? But this is the way we find this extroversion. I think I have to move very fast. I don't know whether some of, okay, thank you. I don't know whether some of you experience this. You ask, I teach first years, which is one of the most enjoyable things you can ever do as a lecturer. You ask students some questions about their personal experiences and they go to their phones. So I asked them, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to Google your own experiences, your own ideas? And they're going to AI. How does that work? For me, I think it is an expression of the problem that we have. So I think the consequences: intellectual dependency, cognitive and intellectual erasure, low confidence, low innovation, productivity, and what I call pupillage intellectualism. Of course, I talk about benchmarking. I think this is reasons for benchmarking, alignment, and my dear colleague and HOD course says this compliance has become law in our midst. We all know how there's a lot of statistics saying African research. All African research, we are about 15% of the world's population. Is the highest estimate is 3%. If we go to talk about impactful research, it's another problem. If we go to talk about original research, it's another problem. I think this extroversion explains a lot of that. Let me see, what do we now do? So this is the problem of my presentation. It is bottom heavy. I will skip this. How do we now work towards originality? At the University of Zululand, over the past 4 or so years, we've been developing a formulation of African thought, which brings together African-centered ideas, IKS, Afrocentrism, all of that, bring them together to make them what I call, I'll move to the next slide, what I call, the bottom part of this slide is African thought with a big T, a distinguishable ideational category that includes African worldviews, African intellectual and cognitive orientations, and is intentional, propositional, and programmatic in terms of its delivery of epistemological changes. This will be constitutive of and consequent upon diverse and concurrent critical processes, which would involve invention, recovery, evolution, adaptation, and mutualism. A lot of this will be curatorial rather than definitional, by which I mean we have these ideas there already. We have ideas from Asante, we have ideas from Mundimbe, we have ideas that continue to come out from many African scholars. It would be to curate them and work with them in a systematic way that operationalizes their intent in the work that we do. And this is a disclaimer of what is not African. It's difficult to say. If I get a question, I'll come back to it, and what is not decolonial, but I'll come back to this. Let me skip this for now. In terms of our research and innovation, an African thought approach to research and innovation would be one that engages in knowledge engagement and creation to resolve African dilemmas, interests. There is no such thing as global problems. If the globe is constitutive of provinces, then provincial problems qualify as global problems. The temptation to follow, you see, it is Western epistemology that pretends to be global, and we know it's not. It's provincial. It's contingent on certain biographies, certain geographies, certain experiences. It is a huge mistake for Africans to make, to assume that in trying to solve Western problems, you are being global. We are not being global, nothing. Look at the whole thing they did about climate change, and they are offering South Africa loans to terminate the use of coal, whereas they are stocking up on coal. They are stocking up on coal, and they are asking South Africans to terminate our use of coal to meet our pressing problems. So research and intellectual activity that is African, that follows the idea of African thought, or that's consistent with the idea of African thought, recognizes and reflects African sensibilities. There's a video that went viral right now. I don't know whether you saw it. How many more? Do I have 2 minutes now?
Yes, I'm giving you extra 2 minutes to wrap up.
Okay, so I'm at 20. Maybe I'll talk about this and just stop there. Yeah. So what are African sensibilities? We have grown to cultivate non-African sensibilities. And what do I mean by that? Sensitivities that do not reflect our realities. So there's that video of some big government guy, I think it's in Harare, who is talking about why are people cooking in the middle of the street? That's a problem. Cannot cook in the middle of the street. And a colleague was sharing with me and was praising. I said, what is commendable in what that guy is saying? What is a bigger problem? Is it not the problem of having citizens who have nowhere to cook, that they have to cook in the middle of the street? Is making the city center clean the biggest problem of an African government? Is that the problem of Africa? How does a doctor focus on treating symptoms when the real disease is not taken care of? And that appears to be what many of us as Africans are doing. I wish I could talk about theory, but I'm out of time. But I'm actually, it's the key parts of what I want to do, this last slide, is that we focus on theory. And if you look at the last 2 bullets there, we should theorize instead of merely teaching, learning, and copying theories from elsewhere. We should theorize. If we theorize, we will come to different understandings of these things we are told, like FDI, economic theories. What is FDI? The idea that Paul Michael left Nigeria and came to South Africa to make South Africa rich. That is the idea of fear, that Elon Musk is coming to make South Africa rich. It's a stupid idea. It's a very stupid idea to assume that Western companies will bring their money into an African country and then they will make the African country rich thereby. But we take these ideas because we have developed Western palates, Western appetites, and Western ways of seeing.
Your time.
Yeah. Okay, that is time. Thank you very much. Let me stop here. I thank you.
Okay.
In my language, we say Wado. In my adopted language, you say Nyabonga. And I know where you are, it's Kialeboha. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You know, philosophers always need a lot of time whenever they're talking what is their passion. But for the sake of times that we have, we have to cut him a bit and give our discussant
it's fine.
Just to reflect on that before people engage.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Prof.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, you can stop sharing. Unless if the discussant want to refer to some specific slides.
Okay. All right.
Thank you so much, Prof. Aghogho Akpome. I hope I got that correct.
You tried.
Firstly, thank you so much for such a timely debate and very, really stretching, I would say. I'm just going to affirm a couple of things that I went through your work, and I want to affirm a couple of things before I go to some of the things that I reflected as tensions. Firstly, what is really significant about your work is that it moves beyond, I think decolonial scholarship had been stuck in a mother where it was probably symbolical, oppositional, and always accused of being critical. And instead, you engage and you interrogate the deeper epistemic architectures that are governing higher education in Africa, and you start proposing things for us. And I think that is really something that is needed in the decolonial space and even in higher education itself. And I also appreciate your insistence on showing us how intellectual dependency in Africa is not accidental, but it's strongly historically structured. And you really resist and refuse to treat epistemic dependency as merely psychological, cultural. You broaden the analysis by linking it to disciplinarity, globalizations, rankings, and AI. And this shows that intellectual extroversion that Rutonji puts forward is structurally reproduced through the organization of higher education itself. I also really, I've mentioned it before, appreciate how you move toward proposition. And I think that's a step in the right direction in imagining an alternative epistemic orientation for African higher education. And then I would have really, I would have really wanted to hear more on the AI aspects of your work regarding to intellectual originality, because I really think it's also timely as it extends all the debates on coloniality as well. So techno-colonialism is important to understand right now where we are in higher education. And lastly, I found myself being refreshed by how you presented African thought as polyvocal. You refused the nativist approach to African thought, and I think that is to be really celebrated. However, I kind of have a couple of things that I feel as I was reflecting through your work that could present a couple of tensions. Firstly, you present this as authentic, original African thought. But these categories usually tend to be unstable. And while you present carefully and you distance African thought from nativism and try to remove it from the romanticization of isolation, I still wonder whether concepts such as authentic African sensibilities risk becoming difficult to stabilize analytically when you're doing some analysis. This reflection is inspired by the diversity, hybridity, and historical entanglement of African societies and even the knowledge traditions themselves. They tend to come into a space where they've been historically tangled up. And how do we then determine what counts as authentically African without reproducing another regime of epistemic gatekeeping? I think that's where my concern is. And another tension is around the relationship between intellectual agency and structural dependency. I think you powerfully critique imitation as I went through your slide and compliance cultures within African universities. But these practices are also heavily materially incentivized. So I'm caught up in a tug of war in wondering if the crisis of originality is epistemic or whether it comes back to the political economic dynamics of higher education. Here I'm wondering, can African universities realistically produce the originality being called for while operating within globally an ecosystem that reward conformity? And I also found in my reflections, as I'm really in higher education policy, so my concerns are around inclusion. And since I'm working in higher education policy, I'm always interested in the question, who gets recognized as the legitimate knowledge producer? When we invoke categories such as African sensibilities, African aspirations, African worldview, who's Africa becomes central? I think that's really something we need to tease up. And certainly, reflectively, how do we avoid reproducing new exclusions based on language, class, institutional prestige, geography, disciplinary location? And how do we ensure the project of intellectual originality remains genuinely plural rather than becoming another normative canon? And lastly, I would really want to thank you for pushing us to rethink higher education as a contested epistemic space and stretching us to now think of African universities as sites of theory production and not only theory consumers. Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Maluza, for your reflections. And then we would like to ask Prof if he can reflect on your comments at most 3 minutes so that we can give other people to reflect on your presentation, because I see there's some 2 people who are engaging online. They would also want to ask questions around your presentation. So at most 3 minutes, reflect on what. Yes.
Fantastic. Can you tell me your name again, please? Just highlight. Fadzai. Okay, is that fine if I don't do the fine? Okay, Fadzai, thank you very much. That's a brilliant response. I really appreciate it. It shows you're engaged, even though I sent you just slides and I sent it just this morning. Let me begin by saying you suggested that this work might provide some prodding us towards an alternative epistemic orientation. I don't use the word alternative for these things.
Okay.
Alternative is second best. Alternative is this is what we prefer. I would really like to have a nice meal, but if you have magwinya, okay. So I don't use that word for that purpose because of the way Western epistemology have posited itself as orthodox and central. So I did say in the beginning that one of my methods is constructive polemics. All right, so remember that. And then what is authentic? And to be authentic and original does not have to be nativist. It does not reject the diversity of Africa. It doesn't. I mean, Africa is South Africa, it's Botswana, it's the Sahel, it's North Africa, it is the Horn of Africa, it is West Africa. All of that is Africa. If it is Nigeria, it's Africa. If it's South Africa, it's Africa. Africa does not have to be unified. Again, the idea of uniformity is an imposition of Western epistemology. If we do not think from a Western lenses, we will not see the problem in diversity, in unity. It's not so much about unity. I mean, if something is Nigerian, it could be different from something that is South African. But in that difference does not remove the Africanness of that other part of Africa. Do you get what I'm saying? So the experiences I have as a Nigerian are African experiences, right? As a Nigerian growing up, living in Africa are African. They are originally and authentically African. My aspirations as an African, what I would like to see myself as a Black person, they are originally African. They do not have to be in contestation, in competition with what you from Zimbabwe have, what Ahmed in Egypt has. It doesn't stop that one from also being African. It is Western epistemology that posits difference that is conflictual and hierarchical. I do not think of Africa as conflictual or hierarchical, but diverse. Thank you. I absolutely romanticize. I think you got it wrong. If you think I don't romanticize, yesterday was Mother's Day. Everybody is calling their mother and romanticizing their mother, the best mother in the world. Why not? So Africa is the best place on earth. Why not? It's not my job to show you what is, to say, oh, well, Africa is, I romanticize. But it's not what people think about romanticization. I don't see anything wrong with romanticizing. If you don't romanticize your mother, who is going to romanticize her? Is it me? I've got a mother myself. Then there's one or other things that you said. Who's Africa? I think I've answered that question. Can we operate in a global world? Again, what is global?
1 more minute, Prof, to wrap up your response.
Yeah. So this does not entail exclusion. The idea of Africa that we articulate does not entail exclusion. See, Afrikaners are Africans, right? Even naturalized Asians who come and share with Africa, who have aspirations for Africa, they are Africans. I do not exclude them. This idea of Africa does not exclude anybody. Remember, if you remember the earlier slides, it is a blend of ideas. It's a blend of voices. It's polyvocal. It is also reflexive. It doesn't build orthodoxies that will remain forever. I'm willing to look at some of my propositions. We are willing to look at our propositions and alter them so long as we serve the interests and the benefits of Africans. That's the idea of Africa that I have. And it's very difficult to say what is Africa, but I think it's a bit easier to say what is not Africa. That which pretends to be Africa, the black-faced categories, vernacularization is not Africanization. Take a thoroughly colonized individual, make him vice chancellor of a university because he's black, and then he carries on the same practices that Verwoerd would have carried out. That is not Africanization. That's deracialization. That's not Africanization. And I'm not interested in deracialization because I don't believe in race, actually. So I'm not interested in that. Yeah, right. So let me stop. I could talk forever. Thank you, Crespen. You have to rein me in.
Yes, thanks, Prof. Yeah. Okay, so maybe before I open, if there's anyone with a question in the room, I see the 2 people were engaging online. We've got Saul who's saying unity in diversity. I suppose the conceptualization of Africa is important to think through. The question of global is also important. Maybe before that, I want to open Tele. You said you wanted to be given a chance to ask around a question on the concept of African thought. Can you mute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, Prof, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I'm actually a PhD student working on exploring inclusive practices for students with disabilities in rural universities. And I'm doing that through Ubuntu paradigm, because I want to conceptualize disability through indigenous perspective. And I have chosen 2 universities in South Africa, Univen and UniZulu, specifically because these are 2 distinctive rural-based universities, which were not part of the larger reforms in 2004, I think, when universities were emerged or merged. And part of that was for these universities to actually preserve indigenous knowledge system. In fact, I think Univen was also one of the universities that was funded by NRF to be the hub of indigenous knowledge. On the other side, you have UniZulu with its inspiring vision, African Note, what is Note for African Thought, which you
yes.
also you talked about. And that was my interest for me to actually include UniZulu into my study, purely to understand their approach of the very same vision into their policy practice. And I was at UniZulu for almost 2 months last year. Unfortunately, I could not meet with you, Prof. This very same concept, it remains in papers. And my experience also, as much as UniZulu is trying to decolonize higher education by co-opting this vision, but the practice itself, it's Eurocentric, because when I asked who were the key stakeholders.
Would you mind summarizing up your question so that you
Yeah, I'm wrapping up, sir. So
yes.
when I asked who were the key stakeholders in conceptualizing this African thought, I found out it were the professionals. The community was involved. Traditional leaders around the area were not involved. And if you were to talk about indigenous knowledge, where do you get it? Because you can't get it from the university. It's from the community, the elderly people in our community. But again, the approach was Eurocentric. So I just wanted to get more information about that from you, Prof. Perhaps I can get your email so that we can have our own discussions. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Prof. Before maybe you engage, if there's anyone in the house who has got a similar or related question that they might pose so that Prof responds both of them. No one. Anyone maybe online who also has got a different related question that would want to pose to Prof so that we give him the two to respond to? Okay, while this maybe people are thinking, I'll give you another 2-3 minutes, Prof, to respond, to reflect on, yes.
Okay, thank you. So thanks, that colleague. Sorry, can I get your name again? I just really like to speak to people individually. The colleague who has the question.
Okay, it's registered as Tele on the, or maybe they can speak out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I said Tele.
Tele. Okay, Matsoso. Okay, thanks so much, Matsoso. Yes, I agree with you. I was one of the colleagues who contributed to formulating these ideas, this formulation of African thought. Yes, we did not involve the community in that formulation, but I do not see that as a problem because we are saying, it's like I said, if you see the last line of that, my bullet says it's curatorial. So it's an ongoing process of curating concepts of African thinking and practice that are helpful to African interests. And then if you, again, you say that the practice does not match the conceptualization, of course I have to agree with you. But isn't that part of human life? Democracy, the idea of democracy I don't think there's anywhere the idea of democracy has matched the practice of democracy. Even in the America that it presents itself falsely as the paragon of democracy, America has been described as an oligarchy. But does that mean the idea of democracy should be done away with? I don't think so. If there's a genuine idea of democracy, the fact that the practitioner has not attained it yet does not undermine, does not negate the validity of the idea. So definitely, there are very many issues that will make practice stray from principle. So I would not disagree with you. I would have liked to chat with you when you came, but my email addresses will be there, and I'll be happy to carry on the conversation with you because I'm trying to develop this into a shareable form, and ideas such as yours will be very useful. But thank you very much. I appreciate your questions.
Okay, thanks, Prof, for that response. Anyone in the room has got a question to reflect or ask Prof?
Yeah, I just want
Please tell me it's nonsense if that's what you really feel. Tell me, all this. I've made these presentations in some European spaces, and I've been saying, the guy just had these nonsense things you do. I say, yeah, but my nonsense is better than your nonsense. But it's fine. So I by all means.
I've got two. I just give your short questions to Prof because I left it 5 minutes on. So Pura and Paul.
my question is
Can you maybe speak up a bit?
yeah, thank you so much, Prof, for the presentation, wonderful presentation. Question is related to the last point that you made, where you said, even though you mentioned it right now, like it's curatorial. So I want to find out who is going to be responsible for coming up with sort of like a unified African-centered originality perspective or originality. I won't say theory, but that element of originality within African universities. Who should be responsible for coming up with it?
Maybe Paul also ask your question, then Prof will just.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. My question is, how do you reconcile Pauline Hotunji's idea that, on the one hand, is against ethno-philosophical ideas, which suggests that we should be wary of how we deal with knowledges from the African space. And then, of course, he is one of the most vocal voices in this area as a professional philosopher, versus the two ideas which I, by the way, find very interesting, the two ideas you highlighted and regarding this thought on extroversion.
Okay, let me start with Paul's question. I think Utunji will be in a better position to answer that question. But unfortunately, he passed on. But we have ways of reaching the dead. Anyway, but the idea, there's a predominant idea of aversion to ethno-knowledge production. And our Fadzai mentioned it as well. There is a strong aversion to ideas of authenticity and originality. I posit that is a European red herring. It is a deliberate attempt of European knowledge production to claim that provinciality invalidates any idea because European knowledge production aspires to be universal. Non-European knowledge production does not claim universality. The colonial scholarship highlights pluriversality. The acceptance that my ideas, my approaches may be contingent on my geography and my biology, and may be contingent on my specific incidental interests. But the European knowledge production claims that it's speaking for the whole world and goes on to carry out genocides. So there's not a problem. I think Utunji may be speaking from that fear, which is drilled into us as we grow up in Eurocentric knowledge production. That don't talk about authenticity. Don't talk about don't be African. Just try to be global. But those who claim to be global, if you drill it to the bottom, they are actually provincial. They pursue European interests. They pursue American interests. They don't pursue global interests. There is no such thing as global interests. There is provincial interests that align with one another to produce a good world. But there is, if I need water this morning, am I going to insist that the person living in a very expensive house in Santin should also need water as I need water if I'm suffering from water? I'm not going to say that. When you go to Johannesburg now, it's probably quite cold. In the Free State, it's quite cold. Come to KZN, it's hot where I am. So if you organize a march that we demand heat, will I join you in that march to demand heat for KZN and I'm in 35 degrees centigrade? I won't. That's my point. So maybe we need to separate those issues. We need to separate this attempt to say you cannot be yourself. Please be yourself. Be African. Pursue your interests, but do not allow your interests to be pursued so that it undermines the interests of the other. And so the first question quickly, I think it's everybody's responsibility. I like what Chinua Achebe says in one of his novels, Antelope of the Savannah. He has an intellectual as one of his protagonists. He says, I'm an intellectual, I ask questions. I don't have to answer them. It's everybody's responsibility. If I'm able to get you to think, if I have an opportunity to ask the question, I'm ready to die and go to heaven.
So, as intellectuals will ask questions, are we not going in circles?
Okay, maybe because of our time, Prof, I'll give you this interesting conversation. Maybe with those online in the room, just give me allow us to have 2 minutes for Prof to respond on what what I say.
Okay, again, that's a brilliant response. It's not a retort. It's a brilliant response. It's a well thought response. I agree with you. But shouldn't we agree that sometimes the best we can do is to go around in circles until somebody takes us on a tangent? So sometimes if I don't have an answer, and that's my problem as a decolonial scholar, as an African scholar with Eurocentric knowledge production. If I don't have an answer, why don't I say, guys, we are wandering in the wrong forest. I have determined that we are not on the right path, but I don't know the right path yet. Then somebody else might take that and say, yes, this is the right path, then we can follow the person. So I agree with you. There's one big European scholar who said it, that the purpose of the world is not just to understand it, but to solve problems. I agree. But at this moment, the idea of thinking African, which is not new, which is not, Asante has said these things I've said. Kwame Nkrumah has said these things. Steve Biko have said these things. So my idea is put these things together in a usable format for other scholars to handle, so that they can also take us from there forward somewhere and stop the dependency on external knowledge productions, which are failing, by the way. I don't have time, but if you follow the decolonial scholars, if you follow Lovugacheni, if you follow Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, he will explain to you how Western knowledge production is already exhausted. That's why the West is desperately trying to bring down Russia, to bring down China in particular, because the power, the preconditions for Western hegemony, the conditions of possibility for Western hegemony are eating away, they are ebbing away. Military dominance, economic dominance, intellectual dominance, they are ebbing away. That's why the West is fighting wars everywhere. And let's be careful so they don't send bombs to us. But thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof, for this engaging presentation. And I believe I saw some were still trying to wake up now to have more questions. But because of our time that we've stretched this up to this time, we would appreciate and thank you for coming in and giving this thought-provoking discussion. I say there was also one who was also asking a question, which I think you were even highlighting as you were giving your last comment. And this marks the end of our today's webinar. And maybe before we close on those online, we are also inviting you to join us on the 25th of May for another live session like this one. So please come on and let's engage and deliberate on such interesting issues. Thank you very much for everyone who's in the room as well for coming in and engaging with Prof. And Fatai as well as our as our discussant, who also really triggered in Prof to come as if it was I don't know how best can I present it, but it was really interesting. And we thank you for your thoughtful engagement in this presentation. So this marks the end of our presentation. Bye, Prof. Oh, I'm losing my mistake.